Hello everyone, and welcome to another one is on land. I might wonder, well, what am I talking about land? Well, I'm talking about land acquisition, the thirst for land, or manifest destiny, west go west young man, oversea colonies, imperialism, blah 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 blah, and all that other stuff. Alright, so let's go ahead and get right to it. So our thirst for land begins, well, immediately. England's overcrowded. They are behind the other European powers when it comes to establishing colonies in the New World. There's a lot of young gentlemen who have fallen under the victim of the law of primogeniture. And so they start to form joint stock companies in order to come over here and establish colonies. Now, through the process of colonization, especially in the South, a cash crop emerges, and the headright system is something that really is an incentive for men to come over here and to gain even more land. Remember, through the headright system, every time you as a plantation owner purchase the ticket of an indentured servant to come over, you received 50 acres of land for each of them. So certain individuals begin to have very large acreage of land, huge plantations for growing tobacco. Others who couldn't get land often came over here and became what we call squatters. You would come on land and just start to cultivate it without any legal right to it and hope that one day people would see that you actually were cultivating the area and maybe you could get rights. That's what happened with the separatists in the Cape Cod area. Now, an ancient Roman law was also used, especially by the Puritans, this vacuum domicilium, vacant land theory, because as the English and other Europeans came here, well, it wasn't as though the land was just open, like there was no one living here. In fact, 500 different nations of people were living here at the time period, the Native Americans. And this was a way of trying to justify taking land from Indians, claiming that they didn't cultivate it or take care of it. But as we've studied, we've seen that it's just the opposite. The Indians actually were very good caretakers of the land. But this was just part of Europe's way of, hey, no, we're taking it and we're going to use our ancient Roman laws to prove why we can do it. Vacuum domicilium. Well, let's move forward in time. And three very important events take place here. The French-Indian War, this war was about land. This war was about the Ohio River Valley, a massive piece of land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Would France control it? Would England control it? Well, obviously the colonists want this land because they see potential, economic potential and growth. And at the end of that war, obviously the French lose, and all that land is acquired. However, the British actually now do not want the colonists to go into this land because of the Indians that are still there. Pontiac's Rebellion takes place. This massive Indian War begins. And the British don't really have the resources to continue fighting, so they establish the Proclamation Act of 1763, this imaginary line that goes along the Appalachian Mountains. And as I told you, if you remember, Parliament actually debated for quite a while, should they actually dig a huge ditch along the backside of the Appalachian Mountains? I mean, think about that for a moment. From basically upstate New York to the tip to the northern part of Georgia, they would build this huge ditch. It's ridiculous. Let's just move on from that. The Paxton Boys Rebellion, I want to put that in there too because this was in Paxton, Pennsylvania. Scott Irish, who are also very concerned about acquiring land. And as Pontiac's Rebellion began, they felt that all Indians were basically a nuisance and decided throughout Pennsylvania that they would attack Indian land holdings and actually slaughter Indians. The rebellion was eventually put down by a Pennsylvania militia headed by Ben Franklin. After the American Revolution, that land is now permanently part of America, that land, again, between the Appalachian Mountain and the Mississippi River. But they have to decide, well, what are we actually going to do with this land? So a land ordinance is passed in 1885 that begins to divide the land into small grid patterns and eventually creates territory. 2 years later, in the Northwest Ordinance, 1787, they established the principle for how a territory becomes a state. And of course, in the Northwest, remember that's Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It also then outlawed slavery. By the time of Jefferson's presidency, he winds up acquiring a huge chunk of land, what we come to know as the Louisiana Territory, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Now again, this is an argument that we can do if we were going to talk about politics between strict and loose construction as well, but let's just keep on the concept of land and what this does for America. Because of all this land, it's a huge incentive, a motivator for people to continue to go west. A market revolution begins, a transportation revolution begins. The steam engine is applied to the steamboat. They're building canals and turnpikes, and they're building roads. And by the late 1820s, early 1830s, you start to see trains appear in America. So with the purchase of Louisiana, it really added not only to the physical growth of America, but also now to the economic growth of America. Of course, it also continued the issue over slavery as well. And as well as this was a good thing economically, socially, you can argue that this was a bad thing because it did perpetuate slavery as well in America. All right, some very interesting treaties that take place here in the 1800s. What is known as the Treaty of 1818, or sometimes the Red River Cession. This dealt with, again, here is the Louisiana Purchase, this area all in white. There's always a debate as to, is this part here part of Louisiana or is it part of Canada? So this treaty establishes the line up here as permanently the border between the United States and Canada. But it also established something for the Oregon Territory. In this treaty, it established a joint occupation between British and American settlers, which eventually is how America is going to acquire Oregon as well. This is done by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. The following year, Adams and a Spanish diplomat, Onis, established what is known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. This is one of the greatest diplomatic feats in early American history, negotiating with the Spanish. What is the permanent border now between the United States and what at the time period was known as New Spain? Although within a year and a half or so, this will become Mexico, but at the time, Spain still owns this. This is also called the Transcontinental Treaty because, again, it trans the continent. It went across the continent, so sometimes we call this a transcontinental treaty. It's also known as the Florida Purchase Treaty because at the same time, Spain sold the rights to Florida to the United States. Of course, you got to remember, Andrew Jackson's already in Florida, and he's already setting things on fire there, so it was only a matter of time before Florida would have become part of the United States anyways, but at least this made it all, legal. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Another interesting treaty that deals with borders is the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, named after Daniel Webster, who at the time was serving as Secretary of State for John Tyler. This is Maine and Canada. This is often called as also the Aroostook War River, because the Aroostook River is here, or the Lumberjack War. This is between lumberjacks, yes, lumberjacks, between Maine and Canada. You're talking about 12,000 acres are in dispute. The British want this land because they want to build the Halifax Road. Halifax, Nova Scotia would be further up in here, along the St. Lawrence River into Montreal, because during wintertime, the rivers freeze and it's hard to get one place to the other. So they want to build a major road. Of course, the people of Maine want to declare that all this land is part of the United States, and that's why the lumberjacks go to war. And the two men, Lord Ashburton of Great Britain and Daniel Webster of the United States, split the difference, 12,000 acres. America acquires 7,000 acres, and Britain takes 5. Britain just wanted to build a road, so they didn't feel like they needed the bigger part of this. Of course, don't forget the Indian Removal Act is also very important. It is also about land. When gold is discovered in Georgia, This is one of the main catalysts to kick Indians out of Georgia, and then eventually throughout all of that area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. It is a big land acquisition that's taken place as well. Some Indians went to court, like the Cherokee. Others, like Chief Black Hawk, went to war. But in the end, all those Indian lands eventually become permanently part of the United States. All right, which gets us to Texas. Texas was part of New Spain and then part of Mexico. And then eventually, Texas had its own revolution and broke away from Mexico and formed the Texas Republic, the Lone Star State. It was its own country with Sam Houston as its first and only president. But throughout its existence, obviously the people of Texas are really Americans, and it's only a matter of time before they're going to want to join the Union. Of course, the government of Mexico doesn't want this. They feel that if Texas ever joins the United States, that would be an act of war. Great Britain will bring loans to Texas because they would like to see Texas survive as an independent country to try and stop the growth of the United States. But again, it's only a matter of time. In the election of 1844, between James K. Polk and that great American Henry Clay, that became a huge issue. Clay loses the election because he flip-flops over the issue of Texas. He realizes it's a slavery issue, and he tells the people in the North that he would only sort of be for it if you can guarantee that there'd be no war with Mexico. Yet in the people in the South, he says, oh no, I think it'd be a good idea. So it seems as though he's a flip-flopper, and it's one of the things that causes him to lose the election of 1844. But before Polk could actually do anything, John Tyler, who's the current president, decides, since his administration is basically a huge bummer, that he calls a joint session of Congress, and he gets Congress to go ahead and vote for the annexation of Texas so that he could take credit. Although Texas doesn't become fully a part of the United States until December of 1845, when Polk is actually president. But this starts off this huge now rush to acquire really everything else they can get from Mexico, which leads to the Mexican-American War. It's a war about boundaries. If I go back here to this map, the Rio Grande, is that the boundary of Texas? Or there's a river here, the Nueces River. Mexico claims that this all in here is still part of Mexico. Of course, Texas claims they go all the way to the Rio Grande. Polk sends General Zachary Taylor here, and he crosses over, crosses back, crosses over, crosses back, and eventually the Mexicans fire upon him. Was Zachary Taylor attacked in American soil or Mexican soil? If you remember, a young congressman, a young Whig congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln, wants to know the exact spot, the spot resolution. Of course, that never gets passed, and instead America goes to war. But this also is a slave problem. David Wilmot proposes his Wilmot Proviso, that any of these lands, New Mexico, Arizona, eventually California, that is acquired from Mexico would have to stay free. Of course, the Wilmot Proviso will not pass, and eventually America wins this war quite easily. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the official treaty that ends the war, and America acquires all that land. Although a few years later, the southern states realize that they need to build a railroad that connects them to California. However, it's not easy because of desert, rivers, mountain ranges. But there's this land right in here that's still part of Mexico that would be perfect coming through Texas into this area, into California. So this Mr. Gadsden is sent here on a mission from Franklin Pierce to negotiate the purchase of this land to build a railroad for the South. The Gadsden Purchase. Of course, even though we acquire this land and we do it through a legal trade and we pay money for it, the South never gets to build that railroad because shortly afterwards the Civil War will start. I want to talk, before I go too further, about the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which also happened under James K. Polk. Go back to the Treaty of 1818 we talked about earlier. There's joint occupation of the Oregon Territory, but there are obviously much more Americans living here than there are those who are British. When Polk ran for president in 44, one of his campaign promises was 4440 or fight, which meant up here, you see it right there, the 44th 40 parallel. He claimed that the United States would extend all the way up into here. Great Britain's claim was all the way down here, the extreme British claim, the 42 parallel. Instead of going to war with Great Britain, America wants to go to war with Mexico instead. That's a whole other issue, but that's what's going on. They sign a treaty and they settle for the 49th right here. The permanent border now is established between the United States and Canada, and Oregon is now part of the United States. Of course, during the Civil War, land is also very, very important, the land out west, and the radical Republicans control Congress. So one of the major laws they're able to pass is the Homestead Act of 1862. This is making sure, now this is during the war, so they're making sure that the people that will settle the West are not slave owners. In fact, the majority of these people are actually immigrants coming in from parts of Eastern Europe and also Germany, and they're enticing them to come out here. The law is a three-step process. It's a pretty easy thing. You file for an application to come out here. You have 5 years to improve the land that you're given, and if you can improve the land within those 5 years, you file for a deed of title, and 160 acres of land is now yours. Sometimes just given, sometimes for a very small price. Pennies on the acre we're talking. This enticed a lot of farmers to go west, to finally start developing what is the last parts of what was originally the Louisiana Territory. And we'll end it with these three things here. Sewards Icebox, or sometimes called Seward's Folly. This is William Seward, the Secretary of State, originally under Abraham Lincoln and now Andrew Johnson. He goes into negotiation with Russia to purchase Alaska. So Sewards Icebox is Alaska. And a lot of people made fun of this. They thought, why on earth do we need Alaska? This is ridiculous. And then, of course, within a few decades, oil is discovered. And it doesn't look so stupid anymore, does it? Oklahoma was supposed to be territory for Indians, but there's a lot of land here, and there's still a lot of settlers coming over. And it was decided, you know what? Let's give this over to the settlers instead. And you have what's known as the famous land rush of 1889. This is a picture of it. People bought deeds to come out here, and on a particular day, they all lined up, and when the cannons boomed, they went rushing to go literally take little stakes with flags on it, and once they got to a piece of land that they liked a lot, if they got there first and put their stake in the ground, that was their land. Individuals who snuck in a day before while no one was looking and tried to get the land basically illegally were called Sooners, because they got there before the cannons exploded. So we get the great Oklahoma land rush takes place. And then by the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, America has decided to become an imperialist nation. The Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Midway Island. This is a famous cartoon of the time period, the American Eagle, and it says 10,000 miles from tip to tip. So America now is acquiring overseas lands. America is becoming an imperial power. And that's basically the development of land in America, or in American history. And those are some important things I do want you to know. And I will see you later in class. Bye-bye.